समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Have you wondered why the Syrian president Al-Shara has suddenly recognized Kosovo, a tiny country in the Balkans in Europe? Now, at first glance, it looks like a simple fallout from Bashar al-Assad's ouster, a gesture to cozy up to the West. But dig a little deeper and you'll see the story is layered, strategic, and full of surprising winners. And the spoiler is the final winner isn't who you think. So let's break it down, and I break it down in 7 parts. First, why Kosovo even matters. You know, Kosovo is small, less than 2 million people, but geopolitically it is fraught and sensitive. It broke away from Serbia in 2008, the tail end of Yugoslavia's messy breakup after the Soviet collapse. Now, that disintegration, which is usually called the Balkanization of Yugoslavia, created 7 countries. And I'm sure you've heard of them: Croatia, Slovenia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. Now, most of them, except Kosovo, Serbia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina, are now a part of NATO and the EU. Now, that eastward expansion of Western influence is exactly what gives Moscow headaches. Serbia, historically and ethnically close to Russia, has always been Moscow's man in the Balkans. Slavic ties, Orthodox faith, and decades of military cooperation bind them together. So when Kosovo declared independence in 2008, the world kind of split in 2 camps. Those recognizing Kosovo, largely pro-West, anti-Russia, and those refusing, or those remaining neutral, and they were largely the pro-Russia group. But here's another nuance which is important. You know, even within Europe and the pro-Western bloc, 6 countries, Spain, Greece, Slovakia, Cyprus, and Romania, still didn't recognize Kosovo, and they are both part of NATO as well as EU. In fact, Cyprus is not part of NATO, but the others are. Now, why did that happen? Because each one of them has its own secessionist worries. Recognizing Kosovo might inspire separatists back home. Globally speaking, over 100 countries recognize Kosovo. And India doesn't, consistent with our policy of never endorsing territorial breakaways, whether it's Kosovo, Crimea, or Donbass. So that's the backdrop. Kosovo recognition equals alignment with the West, by and large, and defiance towards Russia. Now the second factor, and that second factor, we have to come back to Syria. For years under Bashar al-Assad, Syria was Russia's firmest ally in the Middle East. Moscow's only Mediterranean naval base was at Tartus and its key airbase at Khmeimim. But after Assad's dramatic ouster earlier in 2025, everything shifted. Assad fled to Russia. Now, Tartus, the base, the navy base, is still there. Interestingly, never bombed by Israel. But most Russian naval assets there have been redeployed to Sevastopol, which is Russia's Black Sea Fleet. So the big question now is, what is left of Russia's influence in the region? Now, many scholars argue that Russia's Middle Eastern grip is slipping fast. Other group, and I tend to agree with this group, believe that Russia won't let go so easily. Because Syria isn't just about military bases. You know, it's a logistics hub for Russia's wider shadow economy. Through Syria, all the way down to Central Africa, Russian private military companies, the PMCs, like the once famous Wagner Group headed by Yevgeny Prigozhin, operated deep into Africa, tapping diamond, gold, bauxite mines, often off the books. Now, these illicit supply chains matter more than ever to Moscow. They've kept parts of Russia's war economy alive through 4 years of grinding conflict in Ukraine. So yes, Assad's fall hurt Russia's presence, but it didn't erase it. Even in decline, Moscow still has money and mercenaries moving through the region's underbelly. from Syria all the way to Central Africa and Congo and further. Now, the third factor. Let's understand the Al-Shara Putin meeting. And here is where it gets really interesting. Merely a few days ago, Al-Shara flew to Moscow to meet Putin. Now, that raised eyebrows. Why would the man who toppled Russia's ally go visit the Kremlin? Some speculated Al-Shara wanted to negotiate Assad's formal return, something Moscow flatly opposed. Others said he was seeking some kind of understanding to keep Russian support without restoring Assad. But the meeting reportedly went nowhere, and Al-Shara came back empty-handed. And almost immediately after returning to Damascus, boom, Syria recognized Kosovo. It was a calculated jab at Serbia and, by extension, Russia. A symbolic move designed to sting Moscow in the Balkans, one of its last friendly regions in Europe. But hold on, the story isn't over yet. And the fourth factor here is where enters Turkey, the real power filling the vacuum. You know, the thing is, you can't understand modern Middle Eastern geopolitics without factoring in Turkey. Whenever recently Russia or Iran's influence has receded, Turkey has moved in. And right now, Ankara is playing a quiet but powerful long game in both the Middle East as well as Balkans, in fact also in Caucasus. Now, Al-Shara knows that Kosovo's ties with Turkey are also crucial, both politically and economically. And if you ask me what is the connection, the thing is that Turkey has long supported Kosovo, not just diplomatically, but also financially. You know, the Turkish aid agency, TİKA, has poured millions into Kosovo's infrastructure and labor projects. Why? Because for President Erdogan, Kosovo, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, these countries aren't just non-EU and non-NATO Balkan states. They are a part of a Muslim Europe narrative, a club of Muslim majority nations that Erdogan wants to influence. And this is outside of Brussels' reach. And this is neo-Ottoman soft power, rebuilding ties with lands that were once part of the Ottoman Empire, but without firing a single shot. So when Al-Shara of Syria recognized Kosovo, it wasn't just about annoying Russia. It was also about keeping Turkey happy. Because in the new Middle East, Turkey, not Russia, is becoming the indispensable regional power. Even Israel, interestingly, has quietly supported keeping some Russian presence in Tardos by lobbying the Americans as a counterbalance to Turkey's growing reach. Now, here I'm sure you'll ask what this means for India. From New Delhi's perspective, there's a clear pattern emerging. Whenever traditional powers like Russia, Iran, even the US lose ground or retreat, two countries fill the void: China and Turkey. We've seen it in Africa, in Central Asia, in Caucasus, and now in the Middle East. So Syria's Kosovo recognition isn't just an anti-Russia move. It's also a pro-Turkey alignment, a signal that Damascus is betting on Ankara's growing influence and wants it to be a part of that network. For India, which maintains neutrality on Kosovo and continues limited engagement with Syria, the takeaway is clear. You know, power realignments in the Middle East are now driven less by ideology and more by transactional short-term deals. Whoever provides security, grain, or reconstruction money gets a seat at the table. And before I end, I have to talk a little bit more about the great balancing game being played out by Al-Shara himself, because there is a little bit more of this twist. Al-Shara isn't burning bridges with Russia completely. He's provoking Russia, sure, but only just enough, because there is still business left to do. And let's rewind to 2008, not to Kosovo this time, but to Georgia. That was the first modern Russian war of territorial aggression in Europe, years before Ukraine. Now, two breakaway regions from Georgia, South Ossetia and Abkhazia declared independence with Russian backing. Hardly a handful of countries recognized them, but Syria under Assad did. Now you'd expect Al-Shara, who toppled Assad, to revoke that recognition, right? But the thing is, he hasn't. Why? Because this is where the clever balancing act comes. He's keeping just enough goodwill with Moscow to extract transactional benefits whenever he needs them. So consider this. Until recently, the Syrian currency was printed in Moscow. Why? Because it was under heavy sanctions from the West. Much of the Middle East still depends on Russian grain. And soon enough, the global arms market is going to be flooded with cheap Russian weapons and Ukrainian drones once active fighting in Ukraine subsides. Now, for a fractured Syria, squeezed between Turkish control in the north and Israeli strikes in the south, access to cheap weapons and Russian logistics could be a lifeline. So, you know what Al-Shara is doing? Al-Shara is hedging, needling Russia politically but keeping the economic door open. That's not chaos, that's cold-blooded realpolitik. And finally, to conclude, the bigger picture, now you understand, goes beyond Syria and beyond Kosovo. So when you zoom out, this story isn't about two small countries making a diplomatic headline. It's about how power shifts in real time through symbols, shadows, survival, etc. Al-Shara's Kosovo recognition weaves together four powerful threads: realpolitik, religious solidarity, shadow economy, and the global arms trade. It shows how small nations exploit geopolitical fault lines, playing rival powers off each other to extract survival advantages. And it exposes how Russia's decline isn't just military, it's reputational. Meanwhile, Turkey is quietly converting that vacuum into influence from the Caucasus to the Balkans to the Syrian north. And in the end, Al-Shara's move tells us this: recognition of Kosovo isn't about Kosovo, it is about choosing who to irritate, who to please, who to keep just close enough, in a world where every alliance seems temporary. So when you next hear that Syria recognized Kosovo, don't think diplomatic formality. Think a small signature with massive geopolitical echoes, from the ruins of Damascus to the mountains of the Balkans, because sometimes in global politics, the smallest countries make the loudest statements.